Good evening. This, I believe, is broadcast number 7 in our discussion about the book of Exodus in our series, The Old Testament is About You. I've been asked, many times about some episodes or some passages in the scripture that seem to be contradictory. And I'm not going to address all of those, but I do want to remind people that the Torah and the Old Testament, right up until the times of the Holy Prophets, is really a chronicle of the Hebrews and of Israel as a fixed tribe and as a nation state. And chronicles always contain some hyperbole, some exaggerations where people boast about themselves. Now, the difficulty really arises only for fundamentalists. It does not arise for people who are more reasonable. The reason we say more reasonable is because fundamentalists are stuck in a situation where what appears to be contradictions really are contradictions for them, because they are such absolutists about each and every word that the scripture speaks. Never mind the fact that it doesn't say exactly the same thing in different languages. But anyway, there's one of these questions that was raised since I began the broadcast. I'm talking about the Hebrews coming from Avaris in the eastern delta region of Egypt, the area which the scripture calls Goshen. But the area around it, the treasure cities, the palace, that compound, that complex area around Avaris was also called Ramesses. And that may be where the idea that the Exodus took place during the reign of Ramesses came from, although certainly, as we've seen, the Exodus was earlier than Ramesses. I've also been mentioned to me that, well, there just isn't enough archaeological evidence about the Jews being in Egypt and the Exodus. And I don't really think that's true. I think there's sufficient evidence, and one might not be looking for exactly what some archaeologists are looking for. The wellspring where Moses camped in Sinai, Mount Sinai, was something well known to the Bedouins, the nomads, the people who roamed that area, because there was a wellspring there. There were, in fact, at Rephidim, I believe, there were also well springs, and there were some artesian wells in the area. So there would have been many, many encampments in that area. So to suggest that one did not find archaeological evidence of large encampments around the area generally designated as where the Hebrews camped from Mount Sinai, the area around St. Catherine's Monastery today, that can't really ring true, because there must have been many times when whole tribes of nomads had come there and camped, because there was water there and because there was a semi-arid area. So there just must have been a lot of these encampments, and to say that there's no evidence of the Hebrews having camped there, perhaps there's no evidence left behind of anybody who camped there. But a lot of people must have over the years. It was a region where nomads would have come with their flocks for water, and the wellspring was well known. So that's not a particularly valid argument. One of the problems is that at least the Orthodox Jews estimate the number of people in the Exodus as around 2 million. Probably the entire population of Egypt at that era was 3 million. But much more reasonable estimate would have never exceeded 30,000 at any time. And probably even fewer than that would be a more logical a reasonable estimate of how many people there were. I did read many years ago, and I can't remember the source now, but I'll mention it in case somebody else comes across it. The seeming contradictions in Scripture sometimes very clearly ascribes error, and that can be rather seen and designated. And this happens with numbers in the Old Testament, especially large numbers. That scribal error can change something from 1,000 to 1,000,000. So, we have to realize that does happen, and it happens in the transcribing of Scripture. And this again poses a quandary for fundamentalism in it, because if they feel they're absolutely bound to accept as God's own penmanship everything in the Old Testament, then those errors in numbers pose a quandary for them, as they do for Orthodox Jews who want to say there were 2 million Hebrews coming out of Egypt in the Exodus, leaving behind 1 million Egyptians. It doesn't make any sense at all. It doesn't ring true at all. Nevertheless, the Exodus itself does ring true, the whole story, and the story of Moses, as we've seen, has a perfect logic to it, and it's quite a reasonable account. But anyway, going back to our main purpose here, we'll deal with some historical things a little bit later. When we see the story of the encounter between Moses and Tutmoses, the Pharaoh, we have different understandings of what took place. Did God harden Pharaoh's heart just so he could later boast about how glorious he was? Or was Pharaoh's heart hardened, period? And we say God hardened his heart. As people have made a whole theology out of that, of predestination and things, which is, of course, a heretical teaching. But in any case, Pharaoh's heart was hardened in this respect. Now, at the time, the Egyptian culture and society were in a very weak stage, and Egyptians were very much dependent upon these foreign laborers. Didn't want to let them go necessarily. But if we look at Pharaoh and try to look at ourselves a little bit in the same framework, every time Pharaoh refuses Moses' request, something terrible happens. Now, if we were faced with something where something terrible happened every time we refused to follow a given path, we might come to the conclusion that we were the common denominator, and that perhaps our stubbornness was the source of our pain. And this, as a matter of fact, happens so often that people don't. They don't want to look at that. They don't want to think about, why am I always having this bad luck? Why am I always coming to this misery? Why do I have to endure all these various things? And very often the problem is we don't say, well, wait a minute now. I'm the common denominator in all this bad luck. I'm the common denominator in all these unpleasant things that are happening. So maybe I'm creating this misery and bad luck for myself. Maybe I need to examine myself more deeply and see where I fit into this. I have to tell a story about one time I brought my own elder from Romania, Father Mina Dobju, and I wanted him to talk to some of the Romanian people around. And there was one family that continuously complained about somebody put a curse on us because we had vibrant businesses and they all failed, so obviously someone put a curse on us. And I told them, well, talk to Father Mina about it. So they told Father Mina this whole big story about all their failures, and then insisted that somebody put a curse on them.